Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Fola. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to sew a fully lined pencil skirt. It is neatly finished both inside and outside. In the last video, I showed you how to draft your basic pencil skirts. So this is the sewing part of the video. If you are yet to watch the drafting process, I'm going to drop the link in the description box below so you can check that out. So this is the pattern of the skirts we made in the last video. But for this particular one, I want my skirts to be shorter than what we have on the pattern. So I marked my new length, which is 19 inches. And I ruled that out. Then I added 1 inch allowance for my hemming. For hemming the down part of my skirt, I added 1 inch allowance to that. Then I cut that out. So that will be the new length of my skirt. I'm going to do the same thing to the back pattern also. So I went ahead to reduce the length of my back pattern also. I reduced it to the same 19 inches. And I ruled that out, and I added my 1 inch allowance to that. Then I cut that out. I'll go ahead to transfer my pattern to the fabric. So I've gone ahead to cut my fabric. So I'm going to go through what I have here. My front pattern was cut on fold. I have the center front on fold. Then I added 1/2 inch allowance to the top of my pattern. We already have the side seam allowance and the hemming allowance on the pattern. So the only allowance we added is to the upper part, which is 1/2 inch allowance to join to the front band. And on the front band also, I added 1/2 inch allowance to the top and to the bottom. And my band was cut on fold also. My front band was cut on fold. And I added 1/2 inch allowance to the top and to the bottom. We already have the side seam on the pattern. And I cut 2 pieces for my band. One will be serving as the lining and the other will be serving as the main fabric. And I added interfacing to the wrong side of my band. The same thing applies to the back also. The only allowance we added is to the top of the skirt. We already have the zipper allowance and the side seam allowance on the pattern, and we have our hemming allowance also there. So the only allowance we added is to the top of the skirt. And on the band as well, I added 1/2 inch allowance to the top and to the bottom of my back band. And I cut 4 pieces for my band, for my back band. 2 will be serving as the lining and the other 2 will be serving as the main fabric. And I added interfacing to the wrong side as well. And on the lining, I cut my lining piece exactly the same way. The only difference is that I reduced my lining by 1 inch. I reduced the length of my lining by 1 inch. Same thing for my front also. I cut the lining piece the same way and I reduced the length by 1 inch. So we'll start joining the skirts now. The first thing I'm going to do to my skirts is to sew my dart. So all I did was to use my chalk to mark where my dart is starting from. And I used my scissors to make notches on both the fabric and the lining. And I did the same thing for the back pattern also. I marked my darts and I made notches on where my dart is starting from. Then I used the pin to pierce through where the dart is going to stop. So I just used my pin and I made sure it's showing on the lining side as well. Then I made use of my chalk to mark the point where my dart is going to stop on both the lining and the fabric. Just like that. So I've done the same thing to the front pattern as well. So what I'll do now is to go ahead and sew my darts on my skirts. So I'm going to be sewing it on the lining and on the fabric separately. So I've gone ahead to sew my darts on both the front and the back pattern. The next thing I'm going to do now is to join the side seam of my skirts. So I'm going to place them right side facing each other. And I'll go ahead and sew the side seam of my skirts. Remember, we made use of 1 inch for the side seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my side seam with 1 inch allowance. Everything I do to the fabric, I'm going to do to the lining pieces also. I'm going to sew the lining pieces as well. I'll place them right side facing each other, and I'll go ahead and sew my side seam allowance. So I've gone ahead to sew the side seam of my skirts, fabric separately and lining separately. And I ironed my seam opened. So I'm going to set that aside and I'll work on the band. So I'm going to remove my pattern paper from the fabric. Then I'm going to open up my front band. And I'm going to take 2 pieces out from my back band. Make sure you don't mix up the side seam and the zipper allowance. You can label the side seam and the zipper allowance so that you don't mix them up. So I'm going to place the side seam of the back band, the right side facing right side of the front band, just like that. And I'm going to pin that down. Then I'll do the same thing to the other side. I'll place the side seam facing the side seam of the front band. And I'm going to stitch that with my 1 inch side seam allowance. I'll do the same thing to the lining piece also. I'm going to pin the side seam right side facing each other, and I'll stitch with my 1 inch side seam allowance. So I'll go ahead and stitch that. So I've gone ahead to do that, and I ironed my seam opened. The next thing I'm going to do now is to place both the fabric and lining right side facing each other, and I'll match them at the side seam. I'm going to use my pins to hold them down at the side seam so everything can align. Then I'm going to sew the top of my band with 1/2 inch allowance. I'm going to sew the top. Make sure you work with your pins. I will sew the top of my band with 1/2 inch allowance. So this is it. After I was done sewing, I reduced the allowance there and I ironed the band flat. So what I'm going to do now is to sew this to my skirts. So I'm going to take one side of my band. I'm just going to choose one side as the fabric or as the lining, since it's the same thing. Then I'm going to sew that to my skirts. I'm going to place right side of my band facing right side of the skirts. Then I'm going to match them at the side seam. I'm going to pin them side seam to side seam. So I'm just going to make sure I use my pins to pin them down properly. And I'm going to sew my bands to the skirts with 1/2 inch allowance. And I'm going to do the same thing to the lining piece also. I'm going to sew the lining piece to the other side of the band. I'm going to pin the right side of the lining facing the right side of the band. And I'm going to stitch that with my 1/2 inch allowance also. So this is it after I was done sewing. This is how it looks on the right side. So I'll go ahead and give that a good press. Then I'm going to turn it to the wrong side now. The right side of my lining facing right side of my fabric. Then I'll stitch the down part with 1/2 inch. I'll go ahead and stitch my down part with 1/2 inch. So this is it after I was done sewing. And I turned it to the right side and I went ahead to give it a good press. as you can see. So the last thing I'm going to do for this skirt is to add our zipper. For this particular skirt that I'm making, I won't be having a slit at the back of my skirt, but I'm going to show you how to neatly finish your slits if you are going to be making yours with a slit. So all I did was to fold my skirt into two, just like you see in the video. Then from the top of my skirt, I marked the length of my zipper, the length I want my zipper to be. I marked 9 inches as the length of my zipper. Then I marked in 1 inch from the center back. That is for my zipper allowance. Then if you are going to be having a slit, you are going to determine how much slit you want. So I'm just making an example here. So let's say the slit is going to start 6 inches above the length of your skirt. So all I did was to mark 6 inches upward from the length of my skirt. So I just marked that. Then I came in by 1 inch, which is my zipper allowance, from the center back like that. So I just marked that 1 inch like that. So that is the only point I'm going to be sewing. I won't be sewing the upper parts or the down parts. So that is the only point I will be sewing. So what I will do is to make notches at that point. Make sure you align your skirts very well. Then I'm going to notch the down parts like that and the upper parts, making sure it's the exact 1 inch. Make sure you don't notch above the 1 inch mark. So that is what I'm going to sew. I'm going to sew that part with 1 inch. I'm going to sew them fabric separately and lining separately. I'm going to sew that point. So I'll sew the lining piece also with 1 inch. So this is it after I was done sewing. Make sure you press them open. I'm just citing an example here. You know, this is not what I'm going to be making. So I've sewed them fabric separately and lining separately. So what I'll do now is to finish up the slits. So what I will do is to take the remaining parts of my slits. Just look at the way I'm doing it. I'm just going to open it up like this. And I'm going to match them notch point to notch point. The notch point on the fabric and the notch point on the lining. So I'm just going to take them like this, as you can see. So I'm going to pin them down, notched points to notch points. The notch points on the fabric and the notched point on the lining, just like that. I'm going to use a pin to pin down where the sewing part stopped. I'm going to pin that point down like that. I'm going to use my pin to pin that point down. Then I'm going to sew my fabric to the lining with 1 inch. Remember, the allowance is 1 inch. I'm going to sew the fabric to the lining at that point. And I'm going to do the same thing to the second side also. I'll sew the fabric to the lining with 1 inch. Just like that. So this is it after I was done sewing. This is how the slit is going to be on the wrong side. Then I'm going to turn it to the right side so you can see how it looks on the right side. So this is how it looks on the right side. All you have to do is to give that a good press. Just have to bring out your folded edges and you give it a good press. And this is how it looks on the lining part. You can see how neat everything is looking. And the last thing would be for you to fix your zipper. But since I'm not going to be having a slit on my skirts, so I'm just showing you how to neatly finish your slits. So what I'll do now is to turn it to the wrong side, and I'm going to lose up the slits, and I'm going to finish up my skirt the way I want it to be. So I've gone ahead to lose the slits here. So from the point where I notched that my zipper is going to stop from the 9 inches that I marked, I'm going to sew from that point straight to the down part of the skirt. Then I'll follow it up and stop on the lining part where the zipper is going to stop on the lining part. So I'm just going to sew it like that, fabric to fabric, lining to lining, and I will stop at the point where the zipper is going to stop on the lining part also. I hope you get what I mean. I'm going to sew that up with my 1 inch zipper allowance. So this is it after I was done sewing. What I'll do now is to turn it to the right side. So this is how it looks on the right side. And this is how it looks on the lining part also. So I'm left with the part where I'm going to fix my zipper on. So I'm going to be fixing my zipper now. So I'm going to fix up the zipper to the fabric alone, making sure I follow my 1 inch allowance. I'll make sure it aligns with the 1 inch allowance. So I'm going to pin down my zipper to just the fabric alone. I'll be sewing the zipper to just the fabric alone. I'll do that to the second side also. I'm going to pin it to the other side also. So I'll go ahead and stitch that down to the fabric piece alone. Just like that, to just the fabric alone. So I've gone ahead to fix my zipper to the fabric alone. I'm going to open that up and I'll turn it to the wrong side. So what I'll do next is to cover that with my lining piece. So I'm going to place the right side of my lining facing the right side of the fabric like that. I'm going to use that to cover up the zipper like that, and I'm going to pin down my fabric to the lining piece like this, like you see me doing. I'm going to pin them down right side of the fabric facing right side of the lining, and I'll stitch that up following the stitch that I made on the fabric. I'm going to follow that stitch and I will stitch to the lining piece. I'll do that to the other side also. I'm going to pin down the fabric to the lining, right side facing each other, and I will stitch down the allowance to the lining piece. So this is how it looks when I was done. So what I'll do is to cut off the excess I have on my zipper, then to turn to the right side. What I did was to make an opening on the lining piece at the side seam. I made an opening that my hand can pass through. I made an opening there. So I just lose a few inches from my lining piece that my hand can pass through. So I'm going to turn my skirt to the right side through the opening I made. Just like that. I'm just going to bring it out like you see me doing. So that is all for my skirt. You can see how neat it's looking. So what I'll do is to finish up that side, the side where I turned my skirt to the right side. I'm going to finish that up with needle and thread, and I'm going to give my skirt a good press, and that will be all for this skirt. You can see how neat it's looking on both the wrong side and the right side. So I'm just going to finish up this side with needle and thread, and that will be all for the skirts. So this is the final outcome of my skirt. You can see how beautiful it looks. And I paired it with this wrap top. In the next video, I'm going to show you how you can cut and sew a wrap top. I hope this video was helpful. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.